lives that remind us about God, meeting yourself in the sacred text. And I announced it this morning. Zacchaeus. How little lives are made big. It's a wonderful story, the story of Zacchaeus. Luke is the only one who records it. And it's interesting that in Luke's account, the account of Zacchaeus is here, and right before it is the story of the rich young ruler. And that account ends with the disciples saying, then who can be saved? And Jesus says, with man it's impossible, with God all things are possible. It is possible for those of us who are in our continent, that's most of us, the rich, the prosperous. All things are possible with God. That's Luke 18:26, at the close of the account of the rich young ruler. And right after that, right on the heels of it, you have the story of Zacchaeus. And it shows God's grace reaches not only the rich, but also the crooked and the corrupt. You start to see the scope of God's grace, the things that he can do. It's a story filled with hope for everyone who had come to Jesus as Savior with less than an unblemished background. And in case you didn't know it, that's you. We all come to Jesus with less than perfect backgrounds. We're lovers of self rather than lovers of God. Let's look at the account. It's in Luke 19, 10 verses. Luke 19, 1 to 10. Is that in your notes, the text? Look at that, man. He entered Jericho, that's Jesus, and he was passing through. And there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was small of stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry, come down. I must stay at your house today. So he hurried. He came down, received him joyfully. And when they saw it, so the people see Jesus, crowds thronging around, and they see Jesus go up to this tree and specifically address Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector out of the Jewish people, who himself was a Jew, so he's a traitor to boot. And when they see Jesus going to Zacchaeus, they all grumbled, verse 7. He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And you have to just stop and say, who do the people in this crowd think they are? Do they think they're sinless? Do they think Zacchaeus is the only sinner there, Zacchaeus? He's gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner, and you just sense they have no idea of their own hearts. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. Jesus said to him, Today, salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which is lost. So Jesus reaches out to Zacchaeus. The crowd can't stand it. Jesus was always doing that. He would reach out to sinners. Here's the important thing. He would reach out to sinners without ever sharing in or condoning their sinfulness. He wasn't light on sin, but he did want to redeem sinners, for which we should all be grateful, no? Yeah. Zacchaeus is identified in that second to the last verse. He's a son of Abraham. He was one of God's chosen people, and he was lost. the atonement reaches people everywhere in all kinds of circumstances, all kinds of situations. We don't know much about Zacchaeus, but we know that he was a son of Abraham, and we knew that he was lost because Jesus said, today salvation has reached this house. Here's what we know. Point number one. His most famous trait, unfortunately, is his shortness of stature. The text says he was short. I grew up in Sunday school singing a chorus that said Zacchaeus was a wee little man. Remember that one? One of those great hymns of the church. While he was short, I don't know that he would be thrilled to know that for over 2,000 years, we've been singing he was a wee little man. Secondly, we know that he was a tax collector. The text says he was a chief tax collector, verse 2. So that means he was at the top of a tax collecting pyramid, much like an Amway distributor can multiply his or her profit by the number of people selling for him. Zacchaeus had all sorts of people working for him who collected taxes for the Roman government, and they did a lot of the legwork for him. The only catch in the system was Zacchaeus would work largely unregulated. He would up the tax level, skim off the top for himself, give the rest of the money to Rome, and the Jews knew that this fellow descendant of Abraham, this other Jew, was ripping them off. And so they hated Zacchaeus. A fellow Jewish tax collector, and a traitor. He's short. He's crooked. But point number 3, he recognizes there's something special about Jesus. I'm sure he probably came initially out of curiosity. Maybe he wanted to see Jesus perform some mighty miracle. Maybe he thought he would tell some wonderful parable, some story. He comes largely checking Jesus out. We don't know much more than that, but for whatever reason, Zacchaeus makes the effort to get close to Jesus. At least give him that much. He wanted to see Jesus for himself. It was a crowd. It was hard for him to even see Jesus. He had heard what the people had said. Maybe he had encountered people whose lives had been changed by Jesus. Maybe he had heard of the miracles, the lame walking and the blind seeing. But it wasn't enough for him to get everything secondhand. That's what he has going for him. I just want to take a minute to point out the obvious, that with the exception of the rich young ruler, remember, who would not do what Jesus told him to do and went away sorrowful, with that one exception, nobody who came to Jesus for himself or for herself ever was disappointed. Not once. Jesus enriched and transformed all who would simply make the effort to get near him, to come. He still does. You can taste and see that the Lord is good. You don't have to take someone's word for it. You can come. You can be forgiven. You can be made new. You can have a fresh start. Zacchaeus wants to get close and see what Jesus is all about for himself. Do that if you don't know him here tonight. Point number 4. It was a good start, but it's not enough just to observe from a distance. I mean, curiosity will only take you so far. And it is interesting, right in the middle of Luke's account, it's interesting to notice how the whole story kind of gets turned upside down instantly. Zacchaeus starts out thinking he's looking for Jesus. After all, that's why he climbed up in that tree. Can you see it? If somebody had made a movie about this, can you see Zacchaeus up there straining his neck, trying his best to see Jesus? Zacchaeus probably never met him personally. And as he's trying to see Jesus, he sees Jesus coming through the crowd, and he thinks, boy, this is great. I'm going to get a close-up. He should come right here, and I'll be able to see what the fuss is all about. And Jesus gets closer and closer, and Zacchaeus is thinking about this, that he's going to get to see Jesus. And all of a sudden he realizes he's not looking for Jesus. Jesus is looking for him. It's quite a twist in the story. Jesus fixes his eyes on Zacchaeus. There's all sorts of people around. It's clear that there's a throng, a crowd, because they all grumbled when Jesus fussed over Zacchaeus. There's a crowd there. Zacchaeus is the one squinting up in that tree to see Jesus. And then Jesus comes, opens his mouth. But instead of some great teaching like the Sermon on the Mount or some parable, he says, Zacchaeus. He must have almost fallen out of the tree. Hurry down. Verse 5. You, Zacchaeus, hurry down. And Zacchaeus discovers that things weren't the way he had imagined. All the while, he thought he was seeking Jesus, and now he discovers Jesus is seeking him. Must have been quite a realization. Be sensitive when Jesus seeks you out by his Spirit in prayer times, through the voice of conscience, Bible teaching, Bible studies. Be ready for Jesus to be speaking out your name specifically. He seeks. As we should know by now, Jesus doesn't deal just with crowds, and he doesn't deal just with congregations. I like this account. He calls people like Zacchaeus, people like Mary, people like Peter and James and John and Joe and Don. He knows what's in your heart. He knows all the details of your life. He knows when you're faking that everything is fine when it really isn't. Maybe you've been a Christian for 40 years. Never forget that Jesus deals personally with your life. He walks toward you every day. He exists. He lives. He calls. He speaks to your mind and heart through his word and spirit. He stops where you stop. He sees what you do. He walks where you walk. Don't fall into the trap of institutionalizing what is essentially relational and personal. He loves you. He calls you. Paul doesn't hesitate to say he loved me and gave himself for me. He sticks his name in there. 5. Let's do 5 first. Notice that Jesus calls for immediate personal attachment. There's this strong wording in verse 5. Zacchaeus, hurry, come down. You can't help but get the impression that Jesus expects obedience. As he speaks, he expects a response that coincides with his command. The decisions you make for Jesus, make right away, or you probably won't make them at all. Jesus knows most of us aren't deniers of his word so much as we're delayers. But he calls, he speaks. Respond right away. Jesus is pressing here with good reason. He knows the human heart. He knows that tenderness comes and goes in our hearts. He knows that opportunities can easily and quickly be lost. Above all, he knows that eternity hangs in the balance of a well-timed decision. Zacchaeus, now, come down, now, listen to me, now, I'm talking to you now. That's how he deals with your heart. He still does. Maybe it's good just to pause And let me ask you very directly and simply, I need to do this with my own heart. Has Jesus talked to you about anything in the last week and you haven't listened yet? I'm not picking on you. I'm talking to me too. Has Jesus talked to you about anything this past week and you haven't acted yet? Zacchaeus, come down. I must see you today. I was looking at Matthew 7:24-27. Jesus is the speaker. And he says, everyone then who hears these words, hears these words of mine and does them, he would be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. Is there a picture of your life in some way? Something just beating on it. Beat on that house. But it didn't fall because it had been founded on the rock. The rock is everything Jesus says, obey instantly. And everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't do them, that's why I ask, anything Jesus talked to you about in the past week and you haven't done it yet, matters. Everyone who hears these words of mine does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand, and the rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Or 8:18 of Luke. Luke is the one who records the story of Zacchaeus. Take care then how you hear. For to the one who has, that's acting on it, more will be given. From the one who has not, even what he thinks he has will be taken away. I can think I have a walk with Jesus that I don't really have when I don't act on what he says. That's what that's about. What powerful words. Jesus specifically asks us to review how we listen to him when he speaks. It's not just for new Christians. And central to how well I listen is this issue. Every time Jesus speaks, do I hear the words right away? Because every time he speaks, like he did to Zacchaeus, he still says, right away. My tendency is to linger. I can be a slow listener about parting paths with the world or sinful activities, about my devotional life, about tithing, about sharing my faith with the lost, about forgiving enemies, about apologizing, about getting serious about church attendance. Zacchaeus, I want to talk to you right away. Don, I want to talk to you right away. Six. Jesus reclaims people others won't touch. Do you see it in verse 7? And when they saw it, Jesus giving Zacchaeus, this head tax collector, his attention, the crowd can't stand it. When they saw it, they all grumbled, every one of them. He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. When Jesus invited himself, he invites himself over to Zacchaeus' house. That's what he does. He uses this interesting word. It's in the 5th verse. I'm not making it up. He says, I must stay at your house today. Must. What's that mean? Must. He must stay with Zacchaeus because more than anybody else in that crowd, Zacchaeus is a demonstration of what Jesus' time and ministry were all about. The crowd was right, but they were also wrong. Yes, Zacchaeus was a sinner, maybe the worst sinner in the crowd. But how else would Jesus prove the power of those words in verse 10. For the Son of Man came in to seek and to save the lost. Zacchaeus was a perfect candidate to demonstrate that to everybody. They shouldn't have been grumbling. They should have been rejoicing. Yes, he was a sinner, maybe the worst sinner. Everyone else hated him. But Jesus didn't. He came to reach out to those everyone else avoided. He came to offer hope to those who were most hopeless in all appearance. 7. Zacchaeus demonstrates how sinners respond to God's redeeming grace. I left the word redeeming out. It should be in there. It's in 9 and 10. Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. If I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. So we need the example of Zacchaeus today. Redeeming grace does two things, where frequently we only emphasize one. Redeeming grace forgives, and redeeming grace transforms. The life of the vine starts to flow into the branch. So the actual visible glory and character of the Lord begins to spill over into areas that used to be selfish and proud and ugly and stubborn. That's what Jesus was doing with Zacchaeus. This was the evidence of God's grace reaching his heart. So Zacchaeus doesn't just claim forgiveness, he demonstrates changed affections, a new set of affections. Do you think Jesus told him that he had to give back a whole bunch of money? We don't know. The text doesn't say. I doubt it. But again, we don't know. Certainly the Holy Spirit made it clear to him that he had done wrong and it needed to be made right. And all of this had to happen right away. And it was at that point, it's after all those details, that's the point where Jesus says, Today, now, salvation has come to this house, verse 9. Jesus was right, but here's the important point. It didn't take Jesus to see the obvious. Everyone could see that this wasn't the old Zacchaeus anymore. That was the plan. That was the plan. Jesus picks the most obvious outward sinner, the one hated by everybody in the crowd. Why does Jesus single out Zacchaeus? Because he wants to demonstrate to everyone that he can take the most mixed up, wicked life and he can change it, and then they would see the difference in Zacchaeus' life. So here's how this works. We're all in here and we study this text. In a bit of time, we'll pray together and worship together, and that's all fine. There's a big problem, though. All those people out there who are lost and need Jesus, they're not in here. But they'll see a Zacchaeus who goes up and gives half his money away that he had been ripping people off with. They'll see it. And the ones that he's stolen from, when he pays them back 4 times, do you think they'll doubt he's genuinely converted? So what the world wants to see is a whole bunch of people that go to that big building called Cedarview Community Church, and the world wants to see that our lives do not make sense to their value system. That's what they have to see. And then they'll say, Today salvation has come.